The Peddler Was The Genie. The merchant who opens Aladdin with a sales pitch about a lamp has 4 fingers on each hand, and so does the genie, while every other human in the movie has 5. Robin Williams voiced both parts when the film arrived in November of 1992, and for more than 2 decades that was treated as a coincidence. Fans built the case anyway. They pointed at the matching hands, the same eyebrows and the same beard shape, the identical rapid-fire delivery, and the peddler's habit of talking straight into the camera, the way the genie does later. The theory spread across Disney message boards and Reddit through the 2000s and the early 2010s, and entertainment outlets wrote it up over and over, without anyone official saying a word. Then, Disney answered. In October of 2015, directors Ron Clements and John Musker sat down with E! News, and Clements settled it flatly, saying he'd seen the speculation that the peddler at the beginning of Aladdin is the genie, and that it's true. They went further than that. The film originally ended with the peddler turning back into the genie on camera, closing the frame story he opened in the first minute. And that ending got lost in story changes and editing, which is why the finished movie simply cuts away from him and never comes back. Disney released the storyboards for the scrapped reveal, so you can look at the drawings of a transformation that never made the cut. Traces of the structure are still sitting in the film, because the peddler is the one who introduces the lamp, and the lamp is where the genie lives. Fans weren't reading too much into it for 23 years. They were watching the leftovers of an ending Disney had already drawn. That photo hit a boy. The girl in the photograph Kevin finds while snooping through his brother's room was played by the art director's son, wearing a wig. In Home Alone, released in November of 1990, the picture is on screen for a couple of seconds. Kevin delivers his line about her deserving a woof, and the movie never mentions her again. Viewers argued for years that the face looked staged, and the claim floated around as unverified trivia. It was true. The child in the frame is the son of art director Dan Webster, made up to look like a girl, and director Chris Columbus made that call on purpose, because he didn't want a real girl spending the rest of her life as the punchline of that joke. The one gag in the movie built at a child's expense is the only one arranged so that no child would ever have to wear it. Wonka faked the limp. Gene Wilder wouldn't take the part unless he could walk out of that factory door with a cane and a limp, and then somersault out of it. Director Mel Stewart offered him the lead in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory in 1970, and Wilder accepted on exactly one condition, which he set out in a handwritten letter. He described the entrance shot by shot. Cane in hand, a bad limp, the crowd going quiet once they see he's a cripple. The cane sticking upright in a cobblestone, Wonka starting to fall, and then rolling into a forward somersault and bouncing back up to applause. Stewart asked him why. Wilder's answer was, because from that time on, no one will know if I'm lying or telling the truth. He also said he'd walk away from the role if the entrance was refused. The film came out in June of 1971, and the scene plays exactly the way he drew it up. It worked. Viewers have spent decades arguing that this Wonka isn't a kindly host at all, but an unreliable narrator running a test, pointing at his flat delivery in the boat tunnel and at the fact that he never actually stops any of the children. That broader reading is still interpretation. What the letter confirms is that being unreadable was the design, not an accident of performance. The single most argued over thing about the character was decided before filming started, in a letter, by an actor who was willing to lose the job over it. Disney buried a word. There really are letters hidden in the dust cloud Simba kicks up on that cliff, and an animator who worked on the film has said what they spell. The moment lands about 2/3 of the way through The Lion King, released in June of 1994, when Simba flops down at a cliff edge and throws up a cloud that swirls for a few frames. Viewers claimed the eddies briefly formed the letters S, E, and X, and in 1995 it reached the American Life League after a woman reported that her 4-year-old son had spotted the word. The group demanded an apology and asked Disney to pull the tapes from stores and edit them. Animator Tom Cito, who worked on the film, later confirmed that there is deliberate lettering in that frame. It reads S, F, X. It was an in-joke signature from the special effects department. Disney denied the other reading and then removed the argument entirely, replacing the lettering with a vaguer swirl for the 2002 IMAX re-release and the 2003 Platinum Edition DVD. So half the theory was right, and half of it was wrong at the same time, because something was planted in that dust on purpose, and the only question was ever which 3 letters. Disney spent years insisting nothing was hidden in that cloud, then quietly erased what was hidden in it. The Garbage Man is Sid. The garbage collector who hauls Andy's toys toward the incinerator is wearing the same skull print tie-dye shirt Sid Phillips wore back in 1995. Toy Story 3 arrived in June of 2010, 15 years after the original, and that shirt is the thing fans spotted immediately. He shows up briefly at Andy's house, and again at the dump. He has no dialogue, and the film never names him. The confirmation was hiding in the paperwork. Eric Von Detten, who voiced Sid in 1995, is credited as Sid on Toy Story 3, even though the part amounts to scatting rather than lines. Pixar put the character's name on its own cast list for a wordless background role. That's the whole confirmation. Fans built a reading on top of it, that the boy who blew up toys grew into a man who handles other people's discarded things for a living. And that part is interpretation, rather than anything the studio said. What the studio actually did was quieter and cheaper. The clearest proof was never in the shirt at all. It was in the cast list the whole time. By the way, if you're enjoying this, I make videos like this all the time, and subscribing would really help out. Thanks. Tarzan joins the family tree. The man who co-directed Frozen also directed Tarzan, and he has said out loud that the shipwreck which killed Anna and Elsa's parents is the same voyage that produced Tarzan. Chris Buck made Tarzan for Disney in June of 1999 and co-directed Frozen in November of 2013, and fans had already linked the two films through the shipwreck imagery and the timeline before he said anything. In a 2014 interview with MTV News, he laid out the version in his head. The Queen was pregnant. She gave birth to a boy at sea. The ship went down far from Scandinavian waters. The family built a treehouse in the jungle, and the parents were killed by a leopard, leaving the baby to be raised by gorillas. His phrasing was personal rather than corporate. In my little head, Anna and Elsa's brother is Tarzan. He repeated the whole account later in a Reddit question and answer session. Here's the catch. Disney has never made any of it official, and the Frozen sequel closes the door completely, because Anna and Elsa find the wreck and learn that both parents drowned crossing the Dark Sea. So the only version on record from the man who made both films is also the only version that isn't canon. There's a body inside. The creative director of the Cars franchise says the reason you never see one of them open up is that the brain and the eyes are in there. Jay Ward runs the creative side of Cars at Pixar, a franchise that started in 2006, and fans have argued for years about whether these things are machines, animals, or something worse. Mostly because the eyes sit in the windshield instead of the headlights. Nobody wanted this answer. In an interview with Screen Crush, Ward said plainly that the brain and the eyes are inside, and that the team didn't want anything falling out of the side. He has floated much darker origin stories for the world elsewhere, including Cars deciding humans were unnecessary, but he labeled those his own speculation rather than canon. The eyes were moved to the windshield so audiences could read them. The studio has now confirmed there's something behind them. Every power describes a person. Brad Bird didn't hand the Parr family their powers for variety, he assigned each one to match the role that character was already trapped in. The Incredibles came out in November of 2004, written and directed by Bird, and he has laid the scheme out in press interviews since the release. The father is the one everybody expects to be strong, so he's strong. The mother gets pulled in every direction at once by her family, so she stretches. The teenage daughter wants to vanish from every room she walks into, so she turns invisible. And when that isn't enough, she throws up a force field to keep people out. The hyperactive son can't sit still, so he's fast. None of this was hidden. It was planted on purpose, and the man who wrote it has said so repeatedly. And he has also said he hopes he never has to explain where the powers came from inside the story, because the origin was never the point. What holds up is how completely the pattern runs, right down to the one Parr nobody can pin down. The baby's abilities are undefined because a baby's potential is undefined. That's not a gap in the scheme, that's the scheme. Priya was written queer. The Pixar cinematographer who worked on the party sequence said she asked for the shot of Priya dancing with a girl to be put in. Turning Red landed in March of 2022, directed by Domi Shi, and viewers immediately clocked a brief beat where Priya, one of May's three friends, dances with another girl and reads as coded. Nothing else in the film says anything about it, which is why that one shot carried the entire argument. Then, Pixar cinematographer Andrea Go answered on social media the same month, saying she had asked for the moment to be added. That is about as direct as a confirmation gets, because it came from the person who put the frames on the screen, not from a director interpreting the movie afterwards. The studio said nothing. More than 4 years later, it still hasn't. E.T. sat in the Senate. In Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, 3 members of E.T.'s species are sitting in one of the floating pods during the Galactic Senate scene. Steven Spielberg planted a Yoda costume and a pile of Star Wars toys in E.T. the Extraterrestrial when it came out in June of 1982, and George Lucas promised to return the favor in his next Star Wars film. He did, in May of 1999, and the aliens turn up during the Senate sequence, where Star Wars material names the species Asogians. None of it was hidden. Both men planted the exchange deliberately, and neither ever pretended otherwise. So the strange part isn't the cameo, it's the paperwork that got built around it afterwards. Their homeworld, Brodo Asogi, comes from a 1985 spin-off novel called E.T., The Book of the Green Planet. Later Star Wars tie-in material names their senator Greblipes, which is Spielberg spelled backwards, and describes him as having funded an expedition to another galaxy. Fans stacked a shared universe theory on top of all that, and both studios have treated the whole thing as an in-joke rather than a merger. So the joke was never the cameo. Somebody went back and wrote an official reason for E.T.'s people to be in that room and signed it with Spielberg's name backwards. Monsters Lived Among Us. A bonus featurette on the Monsters, Inc. home release lays out a history where monsters and humans lived on the same land before the monsters got driven off. The film arrived in November of 2001, and fans had worked out for themselves that the monster world's absolute terror of human contact implied a shared past rather than two unrelated dimensions. They were right. The featurette, presented in story reel form as a history of the monster world, shows the ancestors of the monsters living alongside people and eventually being chased away, and it establishes that Monstropolis was founded after that split. None of it appears in the movie, which is exactly why the theory existed in the first place. Pixar had a finished origin story for the monsters, and chose to release it as a bonus feature instead of a scene. Dolores lied on purpose. The director of Encanto confirmed that Dolores, the one who can hear everything, made up the line about Mariano wanting 5 children. Encanto came out in November of 2021, co-directed and co-written by Jared Bush, and the film sets Dolores' super hearing up as reliable. During the dinner sequence, she reports that Mariano wants 5 babies, and Isabella's reaction to that number drives the rest of the scene. Viewers watched her face in that shot and argued she was needling her cousin rather than reporting anything she'd heard. Bush confirmed it. On social media, he said Dolores does sometimes lie to mess with Isabella, and that this was one of those times. What makes his confirmations worth anything is that he also says no. He has publicly refused to identify the Bruno-shaped figure grooving in the background during the song about Bruno, and he rejected the theory that Mirabel sabotaged her own gift. So he isn't just agreeing with whatever the internet decides this week, which leaves the family member whose entire power is hearing the truth as the one the director confirmed was lying. Death arrived in Scene 1. The director of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish says death was deliberately hidden in the film's opening sequence, long before the reveal. The movie came out in December of 2022, directed by Joel Crawford, and the bounty hunter known as the Wolf turns out to be Death himself. Viewers went straight back after release and started claiming they could spot him lurking in earlier scenes, including the opening. Crawford told The Wrap that the team had put Death in that opening on purpose, hidden in moments a first-time viewer wouldn't catch. He also explained the shape. The wolf comes from the Brothers Grimm tradition of wolves as the form fear takes, rather than from the usual robed skeleton. So the reveal was never really the point. The film was built so you'd go back and find him already standing there. Disney recalled its own movie. In January of 1999, Disney pulled 3.4 million videotapes off shelves 3 days after release because of 2 frames in a 1977 cartoon. The film was The Rescuers, and the rumor that something inappropriate was buried in it had been circulating for years as the kind of claim nobody could ever prove. The frames sit inside the sequence where Bianca and Bernard fly over New York on Orville the Albatross, in a window in the background. 2 single frames contain a photographic image of a topless woman. At normal playback speed, it's invisible, which is why the story stayed a rumor for 2 decades. The rumor was true. Disney's own employees found it during the home video rollout, and the studio announced a recall of 3.4 million copies 3 days after those copies had gone on sale. Disney's statement was that the images had been inserted into the film in post-production, after the animation was drawn, and who put them there has never been established publicly. The frames had been in the movie since 1977, and they weren't in the 1992 video release. Almost every hidden image rumor about an animated film turns out to be nothing, and the studio usually says so, and that's the end of it. 22 years after release, this studio confirmed the rumor in the most expensive way available to it. A gun refused to fire. Brad Bird pitched The Iron Giant on a single question. What if a gun had a soul and didn't want to be a gun? The film opened in August of 1999, and viewers read it as a deliberate argument about gun violence from the start, pointing at the deer sequence, and at the giant refusing his own weapon systems. Not everyone agreed. Plenty of people argued the film was reaching at something broader, and that the anti-gun reading was being imposed on it from outside. Bird has confirmed the reading directly, describing the conceit exactly that way, as a gun with a soul that doesn't want to be one. The reason the film commits so hard came out much later. A documentary released in 2016, The Giant's Dream, The Making of the Iron Giant, made the personal origin public. Bird's sister Susan was shot and killed by her estranged husband while the film's story was still being developed, and Bird has said the loss shaped how firmly the movie committed to its argument. That kind of commitment is unusual for a children's film in 1999, because the theme wasn't chosen off a list of themes. None of it saved the picture in cinemas. The Iron Giant took roughly $31 million worldwide, against a budget reported somewhere between $50 and $80 million, depending on the source. And it was rescued entirely by home video and word of mouth over the following years. Warner Brothers put out a signature edition with restored scenes in 2015, and the documentary followed a year after that. The answer to the whole question has been sitting at the end of the film since 1999, in a closing dedication 2 words long, for Susan. If this was worth your time, consider subscribing so you catch every upload. Thanks for watching.